As Nikki says, I'm going to talk about a recent psilocybin experience as part of a medical trial. There are some statements I'll make in this paper. If you want to go and check my blog, there'll be a version of this paper which has got links to the various things. So if there's anything that seems unsupported or a bit weird, just go and read the blog, and that way the numbers go up and I feel happy and maybe you feel happier. So I want to take you through a story. The date is Thursday, the 17th of January, my third visit to King's College Hospital Clinical Research Facility in the London Borough of Southwark as a medical study participant. And today, on that day, the research team would be dosing us volunteers with an experimental drug, a drug designed to help people with treatment-resistant depression, and that was a drug called psilocybin. Having checked with the researchers that it was okay, I brought a lucky mascot. So this curious form is Izawa. Izawa is the name given to a spirit that works for the liberation of the psychedelic experience for the benefit of all beings. So a circle of chaos magicians in northern England created or perhaps contacted this entity, I think it was around about 2011, fashioning a representation of the spirit as part of their ceremony. And on that day in January, the spirit would accompany me on my journey. So participation in the trial meant reducing my use of what in medical language are called drugs of abuse, and so that included methamphetamine, heroin, and cannabis. Only one of these was an issue for me. So after the winter solstice, resolutely I restrained myself from indulging in any of those substances, and by January I'd had a month of enjoying being straight edge for science, which was fantastic. So days before the dosing session, I'd undergone quite elaborate psychiatric evaluation and assessment, which necessitated completing various questionnaires, standard medical stuff. Are you feeling suicidal? No. Have you considered the way you might commit suicide? No. Have you considered where you might commit suicide? No. And then through to questions designed to establish whether or not I had a kind of schizotypal personality. Questions like, have you ever seen things that are invisible to other people? To which I said, in the context of this interview, no. Blood, urine, physical tests confirmed the absence of any drugs from my body. My general health was fine, and so we were all systems go. And days before the dosing session, I met the team of therapists who'd be working with me and 5 other volunteer participants. The therapists were an international cohort, mixed ages, genders, ethnic backgrounds, all smiling, all clearly fascinated by the idea of psychedelic psychotherapy. So we assembled in the ward, in which the following day we would take the medicine. One of the researchers explained to the group of participants how 15 minutes after taking the drug, if we'd received what they called the active dose, it's actually like a moderately strong dose, but I quite like the way they reframed it. It's just that this is the active dose. We might notice something. And the person who was leading it said, when you're wearing the eye shades, at first it will be just like normal. Then after a while, if you've had the active dose, it will be as though you're looking into space, perhaps into a space filled with stars or even images, which I thought was a delightfully simple and gentle way to describe the potentially powerful visionary experiences that psilocybin can induce. The researcher went on to advise the group, if you find places in the experience that are dark or difficult, don't be afraid. The darkness is where the treasure lies. Follow it and find the treasure. More elegantly simple instructions, clearly from someone who knew this territory very well. Our instructor amplified this by repeating a core message. Some people might say a mantra or a charm. Go in and through. We were introduced to a simple breathing technique. Breathe in for a count of 3, in for a count of 4, hold for 4, and exhale for a count of 8. Go in and through. The confidentiality of the session, housekeeping, safety, and other matters were all addressed. And I left feeling really confident that the experience would be very, very well held by this team. Now, I must admit, I didn't sleep much that night, for this event represented many things to me. It represented a concrete opportunity to help in a process that, in my own way, I've worked for many years, to help manifest what my magical colleagues in the North called the liberation of the psychedelic experience for the benefit of all beings. So I arrived early on the dosing day. I made my way to an adjacent park, did a bit of Tai Chi, generally spent some time with the trees. I sat in the park and I was visited by a robin, a bird which is a totem for my father, who passed away a few years ago. I'd been with him in his final days, and that was the last time prior to this that I was in a hospital setting. I greeted that welcome visitor and asked for their blessing. Once in the research department, I chatted amiably with the receptionist. A nurse was busy preparing the ward in which 6 of us will be simultaneously dosed. The window blinds were closed. Lamps that resembled candles glowed softly beside each bed. Large, pale-coloured rugs have been put on the floor to minimise the sound of footsteps and make the room feel as cosy as possible. A book of botanic illustrations was by each bedside. Vaporizers gently perfumed the air with sandalwood. Screens were unfolded behind the beds with a pattern reminiscent of perhaps dappled sunlight, and I installed Izawa by the side of where I would be laying for the experiment. I introduced Izawa to the thoughtful young man I'd met the previous day, who was going to be my sitter, and I popped a catkin inside one of the tubular structures of Izawa's body. We had lots of lovely silk flowers, but it was kind of nice to have a bit of that sort of biological life. Now, that morning, I'd drawn a tarot card. Well, if I'm honest, I used an app on my phone. So I drew a tarot card. The tarot card was this one, the Wheel of Fortune, Atu 10. And that was an apposite symbol for the day, because this was going to be a double-blind study. I would have no idea, and neither would the researchers, as to whether or not we received either a placebo or 10 milligrams, or what they call the active dose, which was 25 milligrams of synthetic psilocybin. The Wheel of Fortune spins. The nurse moves beside each bedside, opening a randomly selected medicine pot, pouring the contents into tiny paper cups. The researcher who so thoughtfully described the psilocybin experience the previous day reminded us of the breathing pattern. In for a count of 4, hold for 4, release for a count of 8, and to go in and through. So I cradled the paper medicine pot in my hands, and I made a prayer over the contents, and I swallowed the cluster of tiny pills, putting on the headphones and the mask and laying back. I waited. The music was a classical piece, deeply textured and beautiful, and I listened intently to it. I'd only had a light breakfast, and so I knew that if this was the active dose, I'd feel something within 20 minutes. Then it started. Something wonderful was happening. That unmistakable sensation of the weird and the wonderful. This was at least 10 milligrams. Quickly, I revised my estimate upwards. This was indeed the active dose. The Wheel of Fortune had smiled that day. I have to say I was really pleased about that, because I kind of thought, well, you know, I can spend a few hours lying, and maybe I'll get some sleep, do some writing, but I was really quite pleased when it started happening. With the eye shades on and listening to the music playing, I began, as is my usual practice, to sing quietly as I lay on the bed while the rushes of energy moved through my body, little flutterings and stutterings and twitching and yawning, the kind of effects I've come to expect from the psilocybin medicine. And as the music changed to drum beats and textured electronic sounds, I found myself rapidly ascending into the psychedelic state. Now, unsurprisingly, the trip was profoundly influenced by my setting. Not the calm room transformed from daytime ward to twilight ceremonial psychedelic space, but the very fact that I was in hospital. I brought to mind the fact that I'd seen in the preparatory days of the session, in the corridors, harassed-looking medics, confused visitors, earnestly conversing relatives, patients, their bodies sprouting strange tubes being pushed from ward to ward. I felt repeatedly these shivers of energy moving through me. I wondered somehow if I might be detecting, I don't know, the auric field of the place, the injured arriving in blue-lit, siren-shrieking vehicles, patients receiving their life-changing news, people dying, people being born. My body twitched and danced, an organic layer lying orthogonal to the stream of energy that connected the height and the deep that was my whole being. Yellow, high-visibility jacketed police thronged my inner vision. Here was I, legally taking psilocybin in the heart of London, while out there, The police, who of course have got much better things to do, were at least nominally tasked with busting people for owning and using the same substance that I was consuming in this licensed environment. And this tension had a personal relevance for me. I thought about my mum. So my mum worked as a nurse in accident and emergency in hospital for 25 years. And I also thought about my dad, who was a military medic and a senior member of the St. John Ambulance Brigade. And I thought in that time about how this therapy might help members of my own family, were it to be accessible in a conventional medical context. Perhaps they could benefit from the psychedelic insights and the healing that I've discovered in traditional and in underground settings. So my sitter was immediately by my side as I removed my headphones and eye shades and I sat up to visit the bathroom. The short corridor from the ward down to the toilet had little LED lights, little flickering faux night lights as we went down to the corridor together, just checking in that everything was fine. And once inside the loo, I regarded myself in the long mirror. Ah yes, eyes like saucers. Returning to the ward, I glanced out through the window. Outside, there were ambulances and police cars and taxis, and I was tripping pretty hard. And I said to the person who was my sitter, "It's about 3 a.m. in this club." And he laughed. So we'd taken the medicine, where are we? Yes. We'd taken the medicine at about 10:30, and by 3:45, I was up in bed, beginning to come down. By 4 p.m., I was sitting up in bed, the eye shades and the headphones were off, the music quietly audible through speakers in the room. I glanced at the other beds. One person seemed to have left. Presumably they had the placebo. I kind of hope they hadn't had the 25 milligrams. There was another volunteer in a bed to this side of me who was weeping, and they were being ably supported by the individuals who were around them. And I could hear, and I'm sure you've heard this, the weeping that is the sadness and also then twists and changes to this just laughing, the cosmic joke of the whole thing. Yeah, so they were being held, these tears had this kind of gentle cathartic quality, replaced with laughter at the cosmic joke of it all. I later discovered that that volunteer had never taken any psychedelics before, ever, including cannabis. So I was there in the bed and I poured myself a little bit of water, sitting up in the bed, my blanket wrapped around me, and in my imagination I offered this water to all the important people in my life, wishing that all beings could have access to good, clean water, and I sprinkled a little on the floor and acknowledged the spirit of the place before finally taking a sip. Turning to my sitter, I asked, "Is there any tea on this spaceship?" He smiled and went to prepare a brew. And later I broke my fast with fruit and salad and bread, and as evening fell, I was interviewed by the team, gave them my initial reflections on the experience and was pronounced fit to go. So the other volunteer, who appeared to have received the active dose, and I were the last to leave. We spoke for a while as they waited for their taxi. It was like I could see it all, they said, all the past and the future and all the connections and all the horror and all the beauty and just the joke of it all. And it was amazing. And so it is, this psychedelic state, this remarkable form of awareness in which our minds perceive the embodied truth that everything is interconnected. And while this realization may be ecstatic, it may also provide us with challenging material. And to meet those challenges, we need to consider the wider context of my trip in the hospital that day. The King's College Hospital Clinical Research Facility is funded by the National Institute for Health Research, who get their cash primarily from the UK government's Department of Health and Social Care, and also by the Wellcome Institute, that is Big Pharma. The trial I specifically participated in was funded by Compass Pathways, a for-profit company developing psilocybin therapy in Europe and North America. And these facts may give us pause for thought. So today, there are commentators in the psychedelic community who are moved to warn us about the problematic aspects of psychedelic medicalization. Some have wondered whether the whole psychedelic renaissance is doomed, though they remain apparently happy to sell us their books, their artworks, and their workshops as it crumbles. And in the opinion of some pundits, by taking part in this trial, I'm at least a dupe, if not an active conspirator, in some deep state plot. Now, we should certainly be aware of how sociopathic tendencies in our culture may wish to deploy these drugs. History teaches how the Roman military encouraged the culture of wine drinking to help subdue the barbarian tribes. We may recall the deplorable tale of how in the 19th century the British East India Company weaponized opium against the Chinese Empire. And then, of course, as Jace was mentioning, those more recent and disturbing attempts in the 20th century to weaponize mescaline, LSD, and all the rest. And these days we may fear that we've become numb to our pain, medicalized by McMindfulness, and anesthetized by esketamine nasal spray, docile, unable and unwilling to rise up against oppression. And these fears need to be acknowledged as entirely possible for the moksha medicine of Huxley's Island to become the debilitating soma of his brave new world. We also notice that simply using psychedelics doesn't necessarily make you a good person. On a smaller scale than that of shadowy government organisations, things can go very wrong within the psychedelic community. Of course they can. You can take iboga and only come away with a pinchbeck revelation, or encounter shocking abuses while under the influence of toad venom. And these bad things happen outside of these state actors, and it's therefore essential that we, as a community interested in these substances, are alert and ready to address these problems in compassionate and intelligent ways wherever they emerge. So concerns about the medicalization and state use of psychedelics seems most often expressed by people from the United States, mostly white men, from what I can see. And that makes sense to me. The US is a nation with a proud tradition of individual liberty, an impressive pioneering spirit, and a wary attitude towards governmental power. It's also a nation with many serious challenges and wounds, which express themselves through things like draconian drug laws, rampant militarism, and a barbaric and economically exploitative approach to medicine. Meanwhile, the psilocybin and MDMA treatments in the UK will be delivered through the National Health Service, and I therefore wonder if the fears of capitalist exploitation of psychedelics in the USA would be better addressed not by problematizing developments in psychedelic medicine, but by campaigning for accessible healthcare in that great nation. And while some commentators may rail against any state involvement in psychedelics, it's worth remembering that some of these sacraments were originally the products of commercial enterprise. Big Pharma, for all its faults, gave us psychedelic medicine too. And though we may distrust the re-emergence of a licensed capitalist psychedelic economy, which we should of course remember existed in the early and mid-20th century, these medicines cannot and should not, in my view, remain remain underground and only available to privileged wealthy guys rolling around on Adam in the playgrounds of Esalen and Burning Man. However, I don't believe that physicians should be the only people with a lawful right to use these drugs. And admitting psychedelics into medical contexts should, in my view, go hand in hand with other changes to make these substances more widely accessible. So as someone who lives in arguably one of the most oppressed and closely monitored countries in the world, that is to say the British Isles, I appreciate the American appetite for decentralization and personal liberty. And I support moves to change the laws around psychedelic drugs. And in some respects, America is leading the way through developments such as the vote to decriminalize entheogenic plants in Oakland. That people should have access to psychedelics in settings other than the medical is, to me, quite obvious, especially because I use them in ceremonial and recreational contexts. And there's no reason at all. Oh, no. We'll get to that one later. Quick flash, there it is. There's no reason at all why the scientist and the shaman and the clinician and the private individual could not all have access to these materials. Surely we're intelligent enough to figure out a way to do this. In fact, interestingly, of course, the shaman and the private individual already have access to these materials, although they do so in a context which is unlicensed and which has repressive legislation framing it, and therefore having safe, intelligent, thoughtful, compassionate use is arguably more difficult in that context. But the interesting thing, of course, is that whilst the shaman and the private individual may be able to get the gear, the doctors can't. Our doctors, our healers, are forbidden from using these valuable medicines. And that's what the medicalization of psychedelics is about trying to challenge. So as the psychedelic renaissance unfolds, there are naturally difficult ethical choices to be made. There was a choice I made when I signed up for the Compass Pathways trial, the choice that MAPS made to accept money from the Mercer family. And Rick Doblin gives a clear account of the thinking behind that decision, just as I can explain why I decided to participate in the Compass Pathway trial. Sure, Rick and I could be part of a great MK Ultra Mossad false flag operation of the New World Order, but I propose a different reading. As Terence McKenna said, we're not dropping out here, we're infiltrating and taking over. This is me getting my remittance, which is £302.20p for travel and time for participating in the experiment, wearing my tinfoil hat while I open the envelope, being slightly disappointed I didn't get my Mossad decoder ring sent to me. Some might argue that taking part in this trial, as I said, makes me a collaborator with the evil machine of capitalist violence, which is cheerfully doing its own thing while the ice caps melt. But then I think of my dad, who was a military medic, and the contradiction that clearly is there, the contradiction between healing and the harms of war. But this contradiction is also a connection. So MAPS have chosen to work with veterans as a stratagem, as a way of doing this work, to speed the development of MDMA therapy, which could be then open to everyone, allowing, of course, for America's poor healthcare system. And while we may be dismayed at the deplorable context in which people developed PTSD, we cannot, I believe, morally ignore their wounds. Would it be compassionate to say, well, I'm sorry, you went to war, and so you're not getting this blood transfusion, because otherwise I'll just be supporting the war machine? Well, clearly not. And while some detractors of the medicalization of psychedelics recognize this, none of them propose any other answers. I also wonder whether or not, even though sanctioned by the military, psychedelic therapy may in time have other effects, as well as fixing people's PTSD. Perhaps soldiers treated with MDMA are unlikely to return to work shouting, "Kill, kill, kill!" Are they perhaps more likely to support attempts at dialogue as a means of conflict resolution? Are they perhaps more likely to be unhappy with their children going into the military? Time, I guess, will tell. I would also argue, there's this quote from Gabor Mate says, that there's something really quite deeply radical about healing in its most profound sense. In essence, healing is a highly subversive act in our culture. Whether in a medical or more direct psychotherapeutic sense, our work with people is about subverting their self-image as isolated, simply biological or psychological creatures, and helping them see the connections among their existence and the nature of culture that they live in, and the functioning of all humanity. It's about challenging the idea that someone's value is dependent on how well they fit into an abnormal, unhealthy culture. Ideally, as healers, in the broadest sense, that's what we should be doing. So this is not just about fixing people up and then sending them back to the front. This is fixing people up and helping them transform things so they can come into much better, wider relationships with all kinds of things, including the wars that we fight. Psychedelic therapy may also help heal us by fundamentally changing the way that medicine is done. Because now the therapist has to have all of those introductory sessions and then sit like the shaman of old with the patient to facilitate the conditions in which they do their own healing, which is a far cry from the bumbling pharmacology of sedation and the ubiquitous 10-minute consultation. We may be witnessing a transformation for psychiatry from a discipline with, and this is a quote, labels for everything and cures for nothing, into an approach to healing that successfully combines ancient knowledge and modern science. For Western psychedelic medicine is indebted to the wisdom of ancient cultures, and not only by having learnt about psilocybin through Maria Sabina's generous gift of the mushrooms. So in 1953, two psychiatrists, Abram Hoffa and Humphrey Osmond, took part in a Native American church peyote ritual, and they observed firsthand how the First Nations people were using the peyote ceremony and the medicine of that whole experience to overcome their reliance on whiskey. And in the light of that observation, they wondered if they could use LSD to treat addiction. So they sat in this ceremony, and whether it was in the ceremony or immediately afterwards, they went, Humph, do you reckon we could use this to, like, with the acid that Sandoz has just, that's what happened. And so that means that when our medicine people, our doctors, our nurses, our clinicians sit in psychedelic therapy with their patients, they do so in a lineage that includes the Red Pheasant First Nation people of Saskatchewan. Moreover, in their report to the government, not only did Hoffer and Osman argue for the safety and the healing power of the peyote ceremony, but they also acknowledged the ethical limitation on the rights of medical practitioners to stake a claim about these substances. And so they said, we believe most medical men would object to judge whether to allow or prohibit members of any church from practicing their religion and enjoying their sacrament. It does not seem to us that, as medical men, we have any competence to decide upon these matters. So they were quite clear. We medics, we can talk about medic stuff, but this is a different thing. And there's no reason why the medicalization of psychedelics, any more than the use of peyote by the Native American church, needs to be owned by medicine at all. So they said this, but clearly it is in the competence of physicians to determine whether psychedelics could be a valuable part of their practice, whether they could use it to heal their patients. So on a personal level, my trip that day in the hospital was about connecting my own passion for psychedelics and their transformative power with the opportunity that licensed therapy could provide, including for my own family and for many, many others. The kind of people who don't take their time to go on ayahuasca pilgrimages, the kind of people who don't dance the way their cares in the ecstatic dance floor, the kind of people who don't attend conferences like this, but people, nevertheless, who could be healed by these medicines, who could be healed by these ancient sacred medicines which would be available and accessible as treatments on the National Health Service in this country. And as an advocate of psychedelic inclusion, I hope that I have helped to medicalize the mushroom, which I also regard as a sacrament. May this marvelous opportunity, these magical medicines, help heal those in pain and heal too the disconnections and addictions within medicine itself. May these medicines be available in many ways so that they are accessible to all who may benefit from them. May our culture be transformed for the better by the liberation of the psychedelic experience for the benefit of all beings. Thank you very much.